Hey all here, OS Reviews. You're watching our video review of the UMIDIGI A7 Pro. This is a value budget-oriented smartphone which replaces the A5 Pro from the company that came out last year and sells for about the same cost of roughly $100 for the base configuration model when you shop around. That includes 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of built-in storage, and the price goes a little higher if you opt for the 4 gig plus 128 gigabyte built-in memory edition. It can be further expanded though by a micro SD card on both models if you need additional storage. Now that price point is again very similar to the A5 Pro, and overall it retains a few similarities with its predecessor, including the fact that it has a similar sized display at 6.3 inches with a water drop notch. Resolution, which comes in at Full HD Plus, is also plenty sharp. This device now has 4 cameras on the rear compared to 3 on the predecessor, and the resolution and the quality of the sensors has also been improved. The primary lens comes in at 16 megapixels, and it supports certain AI scene detection modes, which can automatically recognize when you're pointing at, say, food, a leaf, or a person, and automatically adjust for things like contrast to get you a slightly more vibrant and accurate looking shot. Then there's a wide-angle lens, which is also 16 megapixels in the A7 Pro. It offers plenty of sharpness this time around, but a wider 120-degree field of view, which is awesome. In addition, there is a new close-up lens this time around, which is 5 megapixels. It's a micro lens, which, although it may sound a little gimmicky at first, I found it to be surprisingly fun, and I'll expand on that when we talk about the photography element of the phone later in this video. Finally, there is another 5 megapixel depth sensor, which can create bokeh effects, which offers decent quality. Underneath here, there's also a biometric fingerprint scanner, which is fairly accurate and responsive, and the phone now comes in a slightly different design in terms of the color scheme. This one here is the cosmic blue, coated and protected by Corning's Gorilla Glass. I have to say, for a budget phone, this device feels very premium. It not only looks dazzling when you point it across the light, but it has a great weight to it when you're holding it thanks to the use of that glass as well as aluminum metal sandwich design. It's also helped by the fact that it has a pretty large battery, which comes in at 4,150 milliamp hours, which in my testing got me through well over 2 days of use before I needed to recharge it again, which can be done using the Type-C port on the bottom of the phone. It supports 10-watt charging, which can top up the battery in under an hour and a half, which is also fairly impressive. And yes, the phone still retains a standard 3.5mm headphone jack. Certainly feels more premium than the budget price would suggest. Along the rails, you'll find access to a dedicated volume rocker and a power key. The buttons, just like the rail, are constructed out of metal. Both of the SIM card slots can support 4G bands here in the United States. If anything, the mono speaker on the rear is still the same as the A5 Pro, and I would have liked to see something like a stereo set, but it is what it is at this price. Aside from the upgraded camera sensor, the other improvement would be in the software. It's now running on a stock version of Android 10.0, the latest and greatest, that gives us a pretty clean overall software experience without really any bloatware out of the box, and support for improved gestures for navigation and a system-wide dark mode, which is definitely helpful if you want to further save on battery life. With that being said, other elements of the phone are still pretty similar to the A5 Pro, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, considering that phone is still an excellent value to this day. For example, this phone still uses a pretty similar processor. It's the Helio P23, which is no longer the newest in the world, but it is an octa-core chip clocked up to 2 gigahertz, and in terms of raw benchmarks, it still is similar to something like a Snapdragon 625. So for regular day-to-day navigation, especially at this price, it still is perfectly acceptable and feels fairly smooth. Right, so let's start right off with that camera. And the quad lens in the rear are all functional and work again better than expected. To go into the micro mode, we tap on this flower right here, and that will shift into that corresponding lens. It recommends to use it within 3 centimeters of the object. Now both this micro lens and the wide angle lens are both fixed focus, but that's pretty typical considering their purpose is to get up close or get far away, so having that locked focus is not really too big of a deal. The overall result here is actually very impressive in terms of capturing the detail. It's higher than some previous generation low-cost phones that had a micro lens, which was only 2 megapixels. This one at 5 is going to give you more ability to zoom on in, even make out the textures of our fingers if I zoom all the way in there. Here's a close-up of a cursor point on a ThinkPad, for example. So it's actually really fun And as a result, I found myself actually using the micro lens more than I was expecting. The other side of the spectrum would be the wide-angle lens. Again, this was something that was really first pioneered by LG, and it's consistently been one of my favorite features on smartphones over the years. It almost replaces the need for something like an action camera. You can get so much within just one frame of the shot. Fantastic mode to capture more without having to step back when taking that photo. And overall, the quality of the images is also pretty good. Thanks to that 16 megapixels of sharpness, we get plenty of detail, and also colors are pretty vibrant and punchy. In fact, I found that on average, the wide-angle camera was a little more saturated by default than the primary lens. As a quick example, this shot here was taken using the primary camera, and then this one here is taken using the wide angle. You can see colors are a little bit more popping in terms of their saturation. Now the standard camera is also pretty good. You can tap on the AI mode, and by default it can recognize up to 13 different objects. Once upon a time, they were selling points of flagship phones like Huawei's Mate 10. Now we see the trickling down of AI functions in the camera, even on devices which sell for around $100. If anything, the camera is still not the fastest in terms of the shutter speed. It's decent if you're in a good lighting environment, but if you're sometimes in a darker spot or if you have lots of apps running in the background, it can still be slightly slower than, say, on a more expensive flagship to launch, but overall still is perfectly usable. Of course, all of these lenses are going to come with no OIS, or optical image stabilization, which is the norm at this price point. So it relies sometimes on EIS for the primary lens, but for the most part, it does mean you have to stay quite still. In particular, I'd say that the micro lens, which you get very up close to an object, especially if it gets a little darker, it can sometimes be tricky to get a super stable shot. But for the most part, I am very satisfied with the camera setup on this phone, the bump up in terms of the resolution, as well as its a very good diversity of functions. Getting up close, getting far away, having AI detection are all, for the most part, working better than expected for the price point. One final shot here of a leaf that I was capturing using the primary 16 megapixel sensor, and zooming on in, I'm just really impressed here in terms of the detail that I'm seeing. The level of color and saturation that I'm observing is all, again, really beyond my expectations for a budget phone. Let's take a closer look at video playback and the audio quality through the speakers next. So pausing things there, we do have picture-in-picture support thanks to the version of Android that it's running on, so you can get some multitasking done while browsing the web. Overall, it's a very immersive screen for watching back media because of its large size. The quality of the speaker is average. It distorts a little bit higher volumes, doesn't have a ton of bass, but it does get decently loud and good enough, I think, for watching back videos and YouTube with. You can always use a pair of headphones or wireless pairs. Overall, it's still an impressive showing, I think, at this price, and it's a very enjoyable panel for entertainment purposes, no real complaints. Reception quality of the Wi-Fi is also fast. It supports dual band 2.4G and 5G Wi-Fi, and no issues at all when it comes to staying well connected to the source of internet. 4G, when I tried it out with AT&T and T-Mobile here in the Seattle area, also worked without any problems. One thing to mention is, out of the box, the phone doesn't have the drag-up notification tray accessed, but you can bring it back really easily by just long holding, going into home settings, and selecting the launcher style to be the default, versus home screen, which will push all of the applications onto various pages on the home screen in an iOS-like fashion. So it really offers a ton of flexibility using the pretty stock-feeling system that we have on board. Let's jump into the web browser and take a closer look at how it performs there. For the most part, web pages are pretty fast to load, and the scrolling experience is smooth enough when it comes to loading back websites. Even complex ones don't have too many issues. We can try something like a desktop version of a site. The device offers decent haptic feedback, and the responsiveness of the touchscreen is also quite good. No issues in terms of navigating and scrolling along, even complex sites like this one, as we can see here. Of course, the device can install any application that you find inside of the Play Store, since it is running on the latest version of the operating system, and the system specs are more than sufficient for handling. Even higher-end games can still be installed. Of course, in terms of frame rates, if you're doing something super intensive, such as, say, Asphalt, or if you're playing PUBG, you may have to lower some of the graphic settings a little bit to get a smoother experience, but really it's not bad. 2D style animations are still going to run very smoothly. As aforementioned, similar to other devices which have a, say, Snapdragon 625 chip, performance is still going to be good enough for the majority of folks out there. Here's a title called Sky, which offers some pretty impressive graphics and 3D animations as you can scroll along through the game engine here, and you can see here that for the most part it's still very much enjoyable and playable on this immersive display. If anything, I will say that the phone does get slightly warm if you are pressing it hard. It's not really a chipset that thermo throttles or anything like that, but it does get slightly warm. To further optimize on the gaming experience, I would recommend, say, closing out of background apps and just focusing on the one game that you're playing, and that will definitely improve the experience a little bit. Still is definitely more than playable and giving us a very enjoyable experience here on a budget phone. So that's more or less it for our review of the UMIDIGI A7 Pro. Overall, for the budget price that it's being offered at, I think it's an excellent value because of the nearly stock experience for the software, the very smooth overall system navigation that you're getting, the long battery performance, and also the camera system, which although it's not going to beat a Pixel or an iPhone, especially in low light situations, it's still very versatile, which is pretty fun to take snaps with, which really shows that value-oriented phones and budget phones are just getting better and better when it comes to their value as well as performance here in 2020. So if interested, you can check out more details in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the UMIDIGI A7 Pro.